I was playing games the other day when I had an idea. Having a high-end GPU is great and all, but what about the people who don't have high-end GPUs? Well, that's why over the next 2 days, I played games solely on the lowest of the low modern GPUs. Yep, the integrated Intel HD 4600. It's gained infamy online for being terrible at gaming, but is it really that bad? I'm here to see if that's really the case. I ran it through 13 demanding titles to see if it would really stay with tradition and live up to its name. Let's roll on the benchmarks. Starting off with Battlefield 4 running at 720p at the low preset, and on Parcel Storm we were achieving solid frame rates the majority of the time. When the storm was in full swing we achieved a minimum of 10 FPS, a max of 76 and an average of 38. Not too bad considering this is one of the most demanding maps in the game, with 63 other players fighting around me. Though I noticed that other players had a definite advantage over me, with a higher frame rate, and I was losing the majority of battles due to the lower frame rate and therefore a lack of responsiveness. On GTA 5 we ran at 720p normal settings, but we were actually able to crank up a few options like anisotropic filtering, FXAA, and we were actually able to raise the distance scaling to 20%. The benchmark was run during the opening sequences of the game, where we achieved very playable frame rates of 19 FPS at the minimum and 31 FPS on average. The max FPS can be ignored however, since it was achieved in loading screens and menus. I was actually really surprised the HD 4600 could play this game smoothly, and even able to have some of its settings raised. I could have even raised the textures to high, but decided against it because it was causing performance drops, since the GPU was only using regular RAM to load the textures. This result shows that GTA 5 is very well optimized for a variety of GPUs, from the Titan X down to this lowly GPU. On Bioshock Infinite I ran the built-in benchmark on low settings at 720p, and once again the results were pretty decent. I achieved a minimum of 17 FPS, a max of 124 and an average of 32. Keep in mind that this game looks very nice even on a low preset, and other than resolution I find it difficult to see much of a difference between this and the higher presets. Fallout 4. Now, I tried to get it working, but as you can see I was getting extreme artifacting with the 4600. This was me trying to play it at the lowest settings at 720p. I searched for a solution, but it looks like no one was having the same issue as me. It could be a screwed up installation, but I doubt it because I tried it with my 380 and there were no problems. I could have got some mods that might have fixed the problem, but I wanted to be able to benchmark the game as a vanilla one, since some people won't be interested in using mods. If I get it working I might do a follow-up video for this just to see how it runs. Being pretty CPU bound I expected City Skylines to be playable, but unfortunately this was not the case. I flew around the map for a while, zooming in and out of areas, and running at 720p on the lowest settings, the performance tanked when overlooking the city of Los Santos, and only really improved in certain parts of the countryside and while looking out at sea. Now I admit, this is kind of a worst case scenario with a map this large and densely populated, and maybe some of your cities will be smaller, but I'm just taking into account that if the city did become this large, how well would it perform? We got a minimum of 16 FPS, a max of 36 and an average of 25. Not so great. Running on the old but still good looking Source engine, I expected CSGO to run smoothly, and it did, with the frame rate never dipping below 53 FPS and staying at 73 most of the time at 1080p on low settings. High frame rate is vital in a twitchy and unforgiving shooter like this, as your reaction time can be the difference between life and death. While playing I didn't experience any stuttering and it ran super smoothly, even with a few settings such as FXAA turned on. Once again, this game doesn't really look much different on higher settings, and it's important to have higher frame rates than eye candy in a game like this. If you only really play CSGO and don't want to buy a dedicated GPU, then the HD 4600 will do the job very well. Next up we have Dirt Rally, which was run on the ultra low preset at 1080p. This is another game where your reaction time can mean the difference between hitting the apex of a corner or ending up in a ditch. A high frame rate influences this greatly, and I'm glad to say that the 4600 achieved it with flying colours, staying at a stable 59 FPS nearly all the time, with a minimum of 46 and a maximum of 84. This is pretty impressive considering even at the ultra low preset this game still looks great. One of the more surprising benchmarks for me was Project Cars. With all the settings turned down to a minimum and running at 720p, the game looked like something out of the early 7th gen days. So it has to run smoothly, right? Well, not really. On the Azure Coast track with 16 cars, we had 22 FPS at the minimum, 47 max and 35 on average. It is perfectly playable, and in simulation games gameplay is more important than graphics, but it really wasn't a good showing from the 4600. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag at 720p on the lowest settings took its toll on the GPU, with it only being able to cough up 22 FPS the majority of the time, dipping as low as 12 FPS in some more demanding scenes and topping out at 37 FPS. It is understandable though, since this game is incredibly detailed, from the sea battles to the violent oceans to the dense jungles on the islands, and it's just too much for the GPU to handle. The game is about borderline playable in the intro sequence, but I dread to think of the performance in the city of Havana, which even hit my R9 380 hard. In Far Cry 4 running at 720p on the lowest preset, we saw the worst results of any game. The poor GPU was only able to muster a measly 11 FPS at the minimum, a max of 30 and an average of 17, making the game totally unplayable. When trying to shoot with the mouse, it felt extremely unresponsive and made it impossible to shoot effectively. It's not really the GPU's fault though, since the game's effects, shadows and lighting look exceptionally good even on the lowest settings, but also because this game is quite a bad port and it can bring top tier GPUs to their knees. On Rocket League, things were looking up again. At 1080p using performance settings, the HD 4600 achieved 31 FPS minimum, 56 FPS at the max, and 43 FPS on average. I benchmarked it with a 3v3 match in each arena so I could see if some arenas hit harder than others. I could have gotten about 50 to 60 FPS, but I decided to turn high quality shaders on because without them I thought the game felt very dull and the arenas had no atmosphere. That's just my personal preference though. And if 60 FPS is preferred, then that setting can be turned off. For sports fans, I included the only sports game I had, FIFA 15. At 720p on the lowest settings, we got a minimum of 8 FPS, which was only seen during panning shots of the stadium, a maximum of 51 FPS and an average of 36. For a game like this, those frame rates are perfectly acceptable and there were absolutely no stutters during regular gameplay. Finally, we have Euro Truck Simulator 2, a bit of an odd one, but since it has a large fan base and doesn't require much to run, I included it here. At 1080p on the lowest settings with 100% scaling, the GPU turned out a minimum FPS of 27, a max of 45 and an average of 33, which is perfectly fine for this game. Overall, this GPU didn't do too badly. In the 9 of 13 games I tested, it got an average frame rate of over 30, albeit at a low resolution and low settings, but it could still handle almost everything I could throw at it. So to answer the question, can you game on integrated graphics? Yeah, you can, but would you want to? It's up to you. In my opinion though, buying a dedicated GPU is highly recommended if you're in this situation right now. Nearly all of the games I benchmarked here cost about $30 to $60 at launch, so I would advise going without one or two of these games and saving up for a more powerful GPU. Right now at my local hardware store, €50 can get you a used Radeon R7 250, which will absolutely destroy the integrated graphics. However, the GPU did well in less demanding games like CSGO and Rocket League, and I expect that it would perform well in MOBAs, so if you're only into that sort of thing, then the HD 4600 will do the trick. I also presume that if it will perform well at emulation and older titles made before 2010. Another thing to know however is that AMD provide APUs with quite powerful integrated graphics, up to about the equivalent of an R7 250, and are about 2/3 the price of an i5. So if you only want to use integrated graphics, go that route. In years to come we might see more powerful integrated graphics that can rival the likes of the GTX 960 and other mid-range graphics cards. But we'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for watching. I hope this video answered any questions you had. I spent a long time trying to make this as informative as possible. If you enjoyed, maybe consider subscribing for more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next video.